the rise of populist and relatively autocratic parties may be the herald of something new and different. And it may be that we will look back on our recent history as the sunlit moment when there was a maximum emphasis on the freedom of the individual.
Daniel Hannan, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Daniel Hannan, you are a representative, parliamentarian, what are they called? People who go and argue about the shape of cucumbers in Europe?
Exactly. I'm one of the cucumber arguer shapers. Not for much longer. I'm a member of the European Parliament until the day of Brexit, which could be, I think we're weeks rather than years away, but it could still be prolonged a little bit.
Okay, since you brought up Brexit, this is one of these things where I just have to cravenly cater to the demands of the public rather than actually talk about the stuff I want to talk about. What the hell is going on with Brexit?
Okay, here's the short version. When MPs invited the country to have a referendum, it never occurred to those MPs that the country might disregard their advice and vote to leave. And so you get a lot of abstract nouns about what's going on at the moment, that it's chaos, that it's a disaster. You know, Donald Tusk, the leader of the EU, said, you know, there's a special place in hell reserved for you guys, which is kind of rather proving why we voted leave. But if you look behind all those abstract nouns, a very simple thing is going on, which is that a group of MPs are trying to frustrate the referendum result, either by overturning it completely or by ending up with something that is technically Brexit, but that actually keeps all of the obligations and costs of membership. And, you know, the root cause of all the chaos as described in, you know, particularly if you read the New York Times or the FT, the country isn't in crisis. The economy's never been doing better. We've got more people in work than ever before. The stock exchange is stronger than ever, all the rest of it. It's simply a crisis in Westminster caused by I suppose it's the last throes of a ruling class that used to be able to set the parameters and has lost that ability.
So one of the things you often hear, or at least I often hear, I suspect you do too, is that not you in particular, but the whole Brexit team were like the dogs that caught the car, and they never really had a great plan for what comes next. Do you think that's fair?
No. I mean, there was a big doorstopper book produced by the predecessor organisation of Vote Leave, Business for Britain, explaining what would be the necessary changes if we were going to stay, and that would have been the perfect blueprint for what to do if we were going to go. But I'll tell you the problem. Vote Leave didn't then form the government. Right? The almost universal assumption the day after the referendum is that the new Prime Minister would have to be someone who had been on the winning side, because this was going to obviously consume the government for the next couple of years. You may remember there was this rather weird thing where all the candidates basically disemboweled themselves until only Theresa May was left standing. So she then came in as someone who had voted Remain. And how she defined leave was very different from if a leaver had done it, both ways round. So she was unable to make concessions because she had something to prove. So in the early days, she used some very, very harsh language about people who voted Remain, saying they were citizens of nowhere and so on, which a leaver wouldn't have needed to do. A leaver would have said, look, we've all got to come together. It was a narrow result. We've got to try and carry both sides with us. But she really defined Brexit just as coming out with something called Brexit. And of course, the other side sensed that immediately and conducted their negotiations accordingly.
Sort of analogous to where we are with the wall in the States now. We're at the point where anything that can be called a wall will count as a wall.
Yes,
right?
Very, very good. And actually, it's interesting that you picked the wall, because to the extent that there was any policy consistency in Theresa May's view of it, the whole thing for her was about restricting immigration.
Right.
Now, here's a rule of thumb, Jonah, what we might pretentiously call a heuristic, right? If any Brit tells you that the Brexit vote was all about immigration, I guarantee that you are talking to somebody who voted Remain. I guarantee it, right? Leavers know that the real issue for most of us was sovereignty, democracy, taking decisions more closely to the people that they affect. But for Theresa May, it was all about migration. And the proof that she was wrong about that, if you like, is how badly her plan went down with leavers. Because what she came up with was basically a model that would have restricted migration but kept everything else in place. And of course, that was not what people voted for.
But so I could swear there has been at least some journalism, but also some social science that said that I'm not trying to put a pejorative stink on it, but that attitudes about feeling that they were losing their country to immigrants, nativism, that there was some social science backing up the idea that immigration played an outsized role.
Yeah, I mean, this is generally fairly results-driven stuff, and it comes overwhelmingly from strongly Remain sources because it makes their world much easier, right? Much more pleasant for them to understand the world as, oh, we were up against ignorance, bigotry, nostalgia, you know. Far harder than asking whether the EU had done anything wrong, you know. And this is particularly the case in Brussels. In Brussels, it is considered gospel that the only reason that Britain voted against is because they were whipped up by unscrupulous demagogues, that they had a terrible tabloid press that told lies and so on. So the approved responses to Brexit in the EU are disbelief or rage. You can either say they'll come to their senses, it's not going to happen, or you can say bloody idiots, you know, right. Wait until they get what's coming. The one thing you cannot do, the one thing you're absolutely not allowed to ask is, I wonder why they voted leave. Right. Right? I wonder whether we might have played that a bit differently. I wonder whether there's something we could do even now that would make us a bit more popular. I wonder whether any other country might feel this way. Because that, of course, is much harder. That would involve some self-analysis. Much easier just to dismiss all of your opponents as bigots and xenophobes. Yeah.
And again, there's another analogy there with the Trump stuff. I mean, people know that I'm not exactly in the Trump fan club, but the idea that, you know, when I came out with my book, the number of liberals who hated to hear that maybe their pushes for identity politics, maybe the way they talked about globalism, the way they talked about how gleeful they were about replacing whites as the majority in the country, all of these various things.
I just have played a little part, right? And that's so true. And that has been going on big time since the vote in both cases, right? But both post-Trump and post-Brexit. So, you know, when Tusk just said, which he just said a few hours ago at the moment that we're recording, you know, you can all go to hell. The shocking thing is not that he said that. It's the number of Brits who have now got themselves into such a warped position that they will defend that kind of comment against their own country, right? And that, of course, vindicates, just like with the Trump voters, what made them vote for it in the first place. The other parallel, which I think is, I mean, look, I don't want to overdo this. There are, you know, the New York Times view of the world, which is that Brexit was just a kind of British form of Trumpery, is manifestly false, right?
It's also a view that Donald Trump has.
Yes, yes, and the Financial Times has, and so on. But it is. I mean, it is true that they had in common a sense of anger at what was perceived to have been a failed elite. That much is true, and a sense of being slighted as well. Yeah, but, you know, there was not a hint, for example, of protectionism in the Leave campaign. On the contrary, I mean, as I understand it, a big part of Donald Trump's shtick was, I don't want free trade with China. Right? A big part of Vote Leave was, we do want free trade with China. We have to leave the EU to get it because the EU is a protectionist customs union. It's a racket, and if we want to be a free trading country, we want to be. So I wouldn't overdo it. But the one really interesting parallel since is the annoyance of people on the other side that they can't quite disguise that the economy is doing well. And, you know, that is really a bad look. Yeah. If when new figures come out showing that there is record low unemployment or record strong growth or whatever, if your first reaction is to look for a way of discounting or disbelieving or minimizing it, never a good look.
Yeah. But you wouldn't be making the case that the economy is doing well because of the Brexit vote. You're just saying that the prophecies of doom have been proven false.
Proven false to a degree that is, you know, insofar as you can ever win an argument in politics, definitively this is it, right? I mean, because these prophecies were not just coming from Remain campaigners. Fair enough, right? Of course, they're going to make the best spin they can on the figures. But they were coming from the Treasury. They were coming from the Bank of England, from the IMF, from the OECD. I mean, in its official report on Brexit, the Treasury said the act of voting leave, that just the fact of voting leave, before you even leave, will be such a hammer blow to the economy that within 2 years, in a best case scenario, unemployment will have risen by 500,000, and in a worst case scenario by 800,000. We're 2.5 years in, and unemployment has fallen by 800,000. There are more people in work than ever before in British history. Exports are up, manufacturing is up, consumer confidence is up. I mean, you measure it in any way you like, and yet the Financial Times, the Labour Party, and the Remain establishment cannot conceal their annoyance at the economic good news.
All right, so I want to get off this in a second, but what do you say? My colleague, Michael Brendan Doherty, he, who, let's be clear, has some issues related to his proud Irish heritage that sometimes come to play. Nonetheless, he's a great guy. But it's always an interesting frequency when he's talking about things about England or Great Britain. He's made the case that while if he were in England, he would have voted Brexit, but as an American, he's against it because it's better for us to have our guys on the inside.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, that was Obama's argument.
Right.
And it, actually I can see that. If the EU is becoming anti-American, protectionist, hostile.
It's nice having Daniel Hannan on the floor saying...
It's better to have some guys in there moderating. But of course, if you think about it, by definition, that is a good reason for us to leave. Right? I actually think the way the world is moving, these old blocks are just redundant. They are a hangover from the 1950s, and the world is unrecognizable since then. So when the EU was formed in 1956, freight costs were high, refrigeration was expensive, and regional blocks looked like the future, right? Mm-hmm. And the assumption was that big was beautiful, whether in the corporate world or in politics, and the world was dividing into these great blocks. Now, I mean, that is not the world we live in now. We have, cheap flights, we have the internet. Geographical proximity has never mattered less. And what I think matters much more now than it used to is cultural proximity. Mm-hmm. It is easier for a company in my constituency to do business here than across the channel in France, because the companies here are common law, they have the same accountancy method, they have the same, if there's a dispute, it's arbitrated under a common law system that they both understand. It's the same language, obviously. And indeed, very often it will be the same companies, right? The US is the single biggest investor in the UK. The UK is the single biggest investor here. So the idea that we should be locked by geographical accident into a customs union that has no trade deal whatever with the US, I just think it belongs to a bygone age.
So moving off slightly, you're one of the Anglosphere guys, right?
Yes.
And why don't, rather than me butchering it, why don't you explain what the sort of James Bennett and some of these other guys, what the argument behind the sort of Anglosphere movement is and what it's trying to do?
Well, the argument is that there are some countries in the world that share a particular heritage, obviously our English-speaking countries and our common law countries, but that heritage also translates into a number of other things. So they tend to have a similar attitude towards restraining government, towards the sanctity of property, the importance of free markets, openness of international commerce, and so on. And for various reasons, each of those countries has tended to kind of get locked into regional blocks at the expense of relations with the other. And it's been a strong progressive argument that, Australia is an Asian country and Britain is a European country and so on. But that really isn't, I think, the way the populations of the countries think. I mean, I think we feel a kinship and an affinity of values and outlook that, you don't really get with often in the world among sovereign states. We already have a military alliance. That bit is fine. That bit's doing just great. But what I'd love to, the alliance between, we do lots of joint operations with
the
New
bilateral
Zealanders, Canadians, etc. That bit is going way better actually than NATO is. So what would you need to add to well, obviously free trade, right? I would love to have proper, genuine, comprehensive free trade among the English-speaking common law countries that are wealthy enough to sustain it. And so this would be Canada, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Israel. We always forget that Israel is a common law country. We don't think of it as an ex-British colony, but it has the same commercial norms, right? The same accountancy, et cetera, et cetera. It is interoperable. That's the key thing with the others. It has basically the same kind of things. Now, that's a third of the world's economy. What if we had a free trade agreement based on complete mutual recognition? Okay, so then instead of doing it the way the EU does, which is to say, here's what we call a car. If you want to sell us a car, it has to have the following emissions and the number plate has to be like this. What if you just said, look, fine, if you call it a car, that's good enough for us. Right? We trust you. We trust your regulators. Why would you want to produce a car that wasn't any good, right? If we just had complete reciprocity like that, so that it was a kind of free trade that didn't work for the corporates, but that worked for the consumer, that worked for the little guy. Now, I spent a bit of time, not least with AEI actually, we had Derek Scissors doing brilliant work on this project, along with all of the other big US think tanks. Heritage, Cato, Manhattan, CEI. It was like, remember that scene in The Warriors, about the gang, where they look at them all sitting down together. It's like that, right? The first time they've all collaborated. And we came up with what we thought would be the perfect trade. I mean, on a really good day, if Milton Friedman was trying to design the perfect UK-US trade deal, what would he have come up with? But we did it in a way that could be enlarged to the whole of the Anglosphere. And part of it would be not unrestricted free movement of people, but free movement of labour in the sense of an implied right to take a job offer from another country. I think that would immensely increase competitiveness. But because the countries are of fairly similar GDP per head, it wouldn't lead to fears about sort of a mass influx of people from a much poorer place.
Although Southern California would fill up with Brits really quickly.
Well, it's already fairly full of Brits. There's a very old cricket club there. And
Santa Monica, it's weird, it has all of these like old British pubs. The Regal Beagle from Three's Company was, it's a very strange thing.
Yes, in fact, there is a charity in Northern California that exists only to look after destitute Brits in Northern California. And of course, there are very few. There are some destitute Brits in Southern California, but they can't change the terms of the, of the original charter.
So down and out Brits need to heed themselves to Northern California. Okay, so I like all that stuff. I'm enamored with that stuff. We may return to that, but let's change gears for a second. So I loved your book, How the English Created Freedom. And I quoted at length. I use it a lot in my book, and and then I give you a very slight pushback because the story that you tell is sort of a classic Whiggish story, right? That the English are just weird. And I mean that in a good way, right? That you guys cared more about freedom than a lot of other peoples, and it became part of your culture, and then part of it has to do with, as you have this great sort of breakdown of all the different arguments. Part of it has to do with being an island nation, so you didn't have a standing army, which means you couldn't have an absolutist king, so you had competing institutions of power. Part of the common law part. I get all of that. But the only place where I sort of push back is I don't think it was inevitable, right? There is a certain amount of, I think it's fair to call you a Whig, but listeners may not understand there's a difference between being a Whig and a Whiggish historian, right? So a Whiggish historian thinks freedom is inevitable, there's a teleology, and it's almost like a Marxist version of freedom, that the cold impersonal force is just leading to freedom. Would you say you're not a Whiggish historian, but you are?
I mean, that's a very fair criticism. I plead guilty to being a Whig, although not guilty to being English, as you can guess from my surname and first name. I live in England, but I'm not English by birth or ancestry.
You were born in Peru.
I was born in Peru, yeah. But
you may be the most interesting man alive.
But I'll tell you, it's a really, really interesting question. So, I mean, you're right. Whig history is, as you say, it's teleological. Its golden age was really the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and it
Butterfield and those guys.
Exactly, and it saw all of the progression of English history as an inevitable series of steps leading towards the golden age that just conveniently happened to be situated in their present.
Right.
And and Butterfield came out with an excoriating historiographical attack on it, saying, the people at the time don't think of themselves as being progressives, and judging people as progressive simply on the basis of whether their views resemble those of your own age is incredibly bad history. So, the classic example would be, we tend to think of the English Civil War as being a war between progressive people who wanted Parliament to be in charge and reactionary people who were for the monarchy. But that is really not how they saw it at the time. The parliamentarians were, in their own minds, absolutely convinced conservatives who thought that they were defending the ancient constitution against an innovative monarchy that was trying to revolutionize the system. And I would make a similar argument about the American Revolution. Don't underestimate the conservatism of the patriot cause, that in their minds they were defending the rights that they believed they had been born with as Englishmen against a foreign, a Germanic monarchy that was trying to change everything around, which, as it turned out, isn't what happened. But we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that they were progressive simply because they were the victorious side. It was a much more nuanced story than that. But I think you're right. I mean, I plead guilty to being a Whig. It was how Hayek described himself. Interestingly, I think if Hayek and Jefferson were both good with the title, there's got to be something in it, right? Hayek eventually, in that great essay, "Why I'm Not a Conservative," when he, the little bit where he talks about what he is, he says, I now realize I'm an old Whig with the emphasis on the old, meaning...
Right. Which is what Edmund Burke called himself as well.
Which is what Edmund Burke, right. So there you go, Hayek, Burke, and Jefferson.
No,
right? There's got to be something in it, right?
I'm happy. I mean, the one guy in that group I want to kind of get rid of is Jefferson.
Yeah. But actually, at that stage, almost everyone would have called themselves a Whig just after the Revolution.
Right. Well, see, this is one of my complaints, and I've brought it up on the podcast many times before because I'm just that desirous to be popular with the kids today. The essay, "Why I'm Not a Conservative," every libertarian I've known who's wanted to sort of tweak me quotes the title. Yeah. And including Milton Friedman, who wrote a letter to the editor of National Review in the 70s or 80s about it. And the problem is that they never read the actual essay where he says that America is the one place in the world where you can call yourself a conservative and still be a defender of liberty.
Exactly, because you are defending a libertarian constitution.
Right.
Correct.
And
correct. So he kind of made that argument about Britain a bit as well. He was talking about Anglo-America. But no, I think that's right. It's a very, very fair point. But I mean, on your original question, which is a really good one, look, there was a series of happy accidents that led to the development of liberty in the world, right? I mean, it maybe we're living in one of those parallel universes where it went differently in lots of other ones, and we're just lucky enough to live in this one. Maybe this whole thing is a simulation. Right? How freaky is that? And someone's playing a sort of sim game with us. But there was nothing inevitable about it, and the reason that is worth stressing, right? So you listed some of the happy factors that made this come about. Being an island means you don't have a standing army, so when you want money from the country, you have to ask nicely through a parliament. You can't compel with an army. The common law assumes residual freedom. You could make a strong argument that actually there had been a kind of common Germanic inheritance of these things that died out in most of continental Europe, but survived.
The Witan, or whatever you call it.
Survived on the island, survived in Iceland and the Faroes and Britain, and in Switzerland was kind of almost like an island. And of course, the US initially it wasn't literally an island, but it was more isolated than anywhere. And if you look at Washington's farewell address, that was an island. That was the mentality of an island people, right?
The Atlantic was a vast English channel.
So all of these, and the reason that it is worth stressing the accidental, contingent nature is we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that therefore we've done that, right? We've solved the liberty issue, and now it's just a question of waiting for everyone else to fall into line. These things can go backwards, and I would argue that actually the rise of populist and relatively autocratic parties, even in kind of core Anglosphere territories, may be the herald of something new and different. And it may be that we will look back on our recent history as the sunlit moment when there was a maximum emphasis on the freedom of the individual.
Yeah. So so part of the argument I make, and I know you haven't read my book yet, but
I'm really going to now that I know you quote me.
You're in there quite a bit.
Right, and how narcissistic is that?
But that's part of my. I'm sure you don't remember this, but years ago on a National Review cruise, you had said something along these lines on a panel, and I came up to you on the Lido deck during breakfast or lunch, and I asked you about it, and you recommended that I read Ernest Gellner. Yes. And then I went and I've read a lot of Ernest Gellner, and I got a lot out of Gellner, and part of the point Gellner makes is that literally human consciousness changed once and only once in all of human history, and it happened in England. Now, Deirdre McCloskey will say it kind of happened in Holland, and sometimes I get into fights with Dutch jingoists on this point, but
I think the Dutch are right. I think it kind one happening. I think
there's cross-pollination going on.
Of course there was. Again, remember that island or no island, that in that era, sea travel was quicker, safer, and cheaper than land travel. So actually, it was easier to get from Amsterdam to the east of England than it was to get from London to the west of England. Right? I mean, it was sea travel. So of course, there was a lot of cross-pollination. They were Protestant, they were mercantile, all that. But this is accident of geography stuff. Yeah, I think if you look at the basis of capitalism, the joint stock venture, limited liability, the Dutch were there slightly before the English. In fact, where you really see this? If you look around the Rijksmuseum And you see the moment where capitalism develops in art. You see it as you go from one gallery to the next, that for hundreds of years, a painter works for a patron. He works for the church, he works for the prince, he works for the bishop, whatever. Suddenly, explosive moment in the 16th century, people start painting without a particular buyer in mind.
Yeah.
Right? And then what happens? Well, we know what happens because we both believe in the market system. Specialization happens. People get really, really good. Hey, Jonah, you're really good at doing those bowls of fruits. Why don't you do that? I'll do the seascapes. You can do the landscapes. You do the portraits. The Dutch were there first, and you see above the white ruffs and those plump, happy, peaceful faces of people who understood that it was okay, it was virtuous just to do well legally by offering a service to everyone else. Now, why are we not now speaking Dutch? Why didn't Dutch become the language of liberty? Accident. Holland occupied a low-lying, indefensible plain. It exhausted itself in a series of defensive wars against Louis' France, and it was then, from the end of the 18th century, from the end of the 17th century, but throughout the 18th century, that basically the banks and the trading houses relocated from Amsterdam to London because it was a safer option.
Right. So let me defend the Brits and the thesis of your book a little bit more than you're doing. But it's really funny that you bring up this thing about painting, because I was at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg a few years ago, and I had to give a speech later, and I made almost the exact same point. It's like it's one Virgin Mary painting after another for thousands of years in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, and then boom, all of a sudden it's these Dutch masters, and these businessmen getting self-portraits,
Isn't it great? I could spend all day looking at those portraits by Rembrandt and Frans Hals. Just the revolutionary nature. I mean, this is what Gellner meant by the change in thought. And Deirdre McCluskey says something similar, that instead of finding virtue in sacrifice and faith and martial glory, you find virtue in offering a service to the people around you at an agreed price. What a revolutionary change to your whole morality.
Well, that's part of the linchpin of McCloskey. Is she argues that it was the flipping of innovation had been seen as a sin in Europe for a long time, going back to the ancient Greeks, really, and the Catholic Church, pushed it too, and then all of a sudden something very English, flips, and you have this Lockean notion that the fruits of your labor belong to you, and that changes sort of everything.
And what a great thing! I mean, when Napoleon was planning to invade us, he said, you're a nation of boutiquiers, you're a nation of shopkeepers. Well, what would you rather live in? I mean, who has brought more happiness? Would you rather live in a nation of monks, a nation of generals, a nation of trade union officials, anti-racism outreach workers? I mean, what better than to live in a nation of shopkeepers?
Better than Prussia at the time. So part of the argument I make in the book is that these quirky, weird things from English culture, the concept of a man's home is his castle, and therefore the sovereign needs some good reason to go in. It takes a long time, but that basically is where we get the Fourth Amendment. And you take Locke's Notes on Toleration, where he has this wonderful, love letter to tolerance, where we have to let these charismatic Protestant faiths have space in our society, but not the Catholics. And then, but then it comes to America, and Jefferson takes the principle and expands it, right? And so that the beauty of the American founding is that it takes what were quirky cultural attributes, it sort of puts them in a centrifuge and pulls them out as sort of golden principles. And I think one of the reasons that I want to get back to this is that part of the problem is that what you're talking about across Europe, and how we may be in sort of a great parenthesis, at the end of some great parenthesis in human history, is that the abstractions, as important as they are and how necessary as they are to organize a society according to neutral rules, right? So the extended order needs to be, the macrocosm, as Hayek would call it, needs to be about contracts and Gesellschaft, right? And the microcosm is all about the Gemeinschaft. If you don't have the right Gemeinschaft, you don't have the right family that teaches these things, not as abstractions, but as deeply felt cultural commitments, that we just love freedom for its own sake, what you get is corruption. You get the rotting away of things. And you look at throughout Europe and big chunks of the United States now, is we do not teach people to be culturally attached to these things.
What you've just said is so important, Jonah. In fact, it's so important that we should try and find a way of saying it that doesn't involve saying Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft. But I find a slightly more...
Frequent listeners of this podcast have heard me go without different ways with it, but
But I mean, okay, it's a bit like, when people, the really irritating leftist thing of saying, what is the cause of poverty? And you want to tear your hair out. I mean, I don't want to tear my hair out. I haven't got any hair, but, you would want to tear your thick and luscious locks out. I mean, poverty is our primeval condition, for goodness sake. The question is, what creates wealth, right? I would say exactly the same about corruption, right? When people say, what creates political corruption? It is extraordinary that there are places where the rulers do not just systematically loot the entire state, right? For most of the last 10,000 years, that was the story of human history. We were serfs and slaves while a tiny clique basically treated everything as private property and didn't draw any distinction between their public role and their private greed. So the interesting question is, how did we, in certain countries, particularly countries that are lucky enough to speak this language, develop a system where it wasn't just that it constrained that tendency, but it was usefully channeled. The way to fulfill your greed was actually to do something that was socially useful. And I think what you just said, the importance of communicating these ideas, right? Liberty is counterintuitive.
It's unnatural.
It is, right. So we are programmed towards tribalism. We are programmed to not to listen to an idea on its merits, but to gauge it on the basis of whether we like the person saying it or not. We are programmed towards hierarchy. I think we're probably programmed towards some kind of absolute monarchy. You look at even when we imagine in our science fiction, in our sort of Star Wars, we recreate it with emperors and princes and things, right? So all of the things that we've built, all of these, at its broadest, these republican virtues of standing...
Small r republican
Small r republican. Self-reliance and personal autonomy and sanctity of property and freedom of exchange and contract and all the rest of it. These are all counterintuitive ideas in the literal sense that they are running up against instincts and intuitions encoded by a million years of evolution. And so if you are looking to explain the decline of Enlightenment values in higher education, or more widely now in the political system, there's no mystery, right? It's that we're ceasing to teach it. You have to inculcate in people, you have to hammer in, you have to make them read their John Locke and their Blackwood and so on, and even at an earlier level, teachers at junior school need to start encouraging the idea that the rules are not just what I say they are, right? The rules are abstract and they're above even me as the teacher. And that is you and I were brought up to be so habituated to that idea that we don't stop and think how freaky it is, right? But as soon as you stop teaching it, people will lose it.
Right. As the Roman poet Horace says, you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, but it always comes rushing back in. And
exactly.
And so that's the overarching theme of my book, is this the corruption is natural. You go to Afghanistan and you tell them, you can't give your cousin this contract. I'm like, what are you talking about? This is how politics has been done for 2,000 years. And they're right. We're the weird ones, and we don't understand that. And so much of the social justice stuff, so much of the, the socialism envy that's coming back is reactionary. It is trying to impose old ways of thinking, gussied up in new arguments. But in reality, the only really new thing in the last 10,000 years, putting religion aside, is this thing, is liberal democratic capitalism.
And what a thing, right? And
it's what a wonderful thing.
And it is the single most important factor in your life and in mine and in the lives of everyone watching, because the fact that they are able to watch or listen to this podcast is enough to tell me that, right?
That's right.
That they are the beneficiaries of this unbelievable explosion of wealth.
Right.
Brought about not through any discovery of any new mineral or anything like that, but just a different way of thinking about society, property rights and contract.
All right, since we're in violent agreement on all of that, let's be a little more granular. What the hell is happening in Europe? Why is this argument falling on deaf ears as much as it is?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and rather troubling question. I mean, one part of the answer, because these things never have a single course, part of the answer is obviously the financial crisis and more precisely the reaction to it. Right? What people saw with the bank bailouts in the US as in Europe was that some very wealthy bankers and bondholders were rescued from the consequences of their own mistakes by expropriating everybody else through the tax system.
Right.
And for the first time in my life, that seemed to vindicate a big part of the argument of the extreme left. Because the extreme left always used to say, this whole capitalism thing is a lie, right? There's no meritocracy. There's no freedom. All it is, it's just a way for the rich to hang on to their possessions while spinning a story to the rest of us whereby we're supposedly given a chance. Now, I always thought that was self-evident nonsense, and the proof of what nonsense it was where people tried to apply the opposite, and behind the Iron Curtain, you saw real elitism there, and the horror of concentrating power with a group of people in those places. But there was that moment round about 2009 when the money was being sprayed around, that for the first time in my life, that critique appeared to be true. And even now, I still get pretty angry actually about that. I mean, in the UK, we took $1 trillion. Where is it now? Nobody really knows. Who got it?
Socialized losses,
really knows,
privatized profits.
Right. So people and that inevitably led to a loss of confidence, a loss of legitimacy in the market system, and a push to the political extremes. So that's a bit of it. But I think there may be something else going on. When you spoke about you used the phrase maybe the liberal period was bracketed, and we've come to the close of the parentheses. There is, in my mind, a horrifying possibility that we have up until now lived through an unusual kind of interglacial period where there are norms of civility based on a broad acceptance of liberal democracy in Western societies. And that period really only lasted from the kind of 30s to the 2000s. And that we may now be returning to a more angry and tribal glacial period, because it will be a colder and darker period. Now, I think there are challenges. If like you or like me, if you're someone who believes in a market system, if you're a conservative in the Anglo-American sense, that poses huge challenges, right? I mean, I don't think this is an inevitable disaster for us by any means, but we need to understand the way in which new forces have been brought into politics, and we need to understand how to work with those forces and how, which ones are beyond the pale. And this, I think, you see it with the rise of protectionism here. You see it with the rise of angry anti-immigrant parties in Europe. It's not enough to say you're all a bunch of ignorant, racist idiots. I mean, that was a big part of what caused the thing in the first place. But nor is it quite enough just to say, okay, let's just go in completely with this new way of doing things. This is the future. Those can't be the only two alternatives.
So one of the explanations for America that I put a lot of weight behind, I mean, I think financial crisis is obviously one of the causes. There's a lot of data that shows that populist movements tend to have very long tails in the wake of financial crises. But one of the things that our colleague, Tim Carney, is coming out with a book that addresses some of this, is that we've been drawing down social capital, that institutions, which are the things that actually civilize people, right? I mean, the Constitution doesn't civilize people. The family civilizes people, and then the concentric circles of institutions outside of. When those things are breaking down, and we've known for a very long time that when the family and local institutions, like particularly religious institutions, break down, people revert back to human nature. I mean, that's why young men join gangs for the last 10,000 years, right? And so I guess part of my question is a factual one. Is the breakdown of institutions the same or analogous in Europe? You can see how communism did enormous damage to civil society, but what about England?
Right. So first of all, we should bracket again the fact that no one could accuse the good Tim Carney of not doing his bit. He coaches Little League, and he's a one-man civil society machine. He lives his beliefs in a way that very few people do.
And I think he has something like 63 kids now.
Exactly. God bless him. Right. And Ben Sass has written a similar book about this, right? And I just want to, because never ever miss an opportunity to plug Ben Sass, who I think is one of the great forces for good in
frequent guest on this podcast.
Brilliant man. And of course, there is something in that, right? It's the little platoons, and again, they were very unusual, and they were partly a function of the common law. They were partly a function of something quite extraordinary, which is the common law's peculiar emphasis on the rights of the individual even after death, right? So that you can leave your money to a trust that will then, I mean, again, stand back. How weird is it that the wishes of the dead should trump the needs of the living?
Right.
And yet such is the emphasis on individual rights in the common law system that it does. And that meant that art collections, orphanages, every kind of charity could get going, filling the space between individual and state. And
right.
Now, is that in decline? Well, it hasn't been systematically destroyed in the way that it was in the Eastern Bloc. János Kadar in Hungary had the job of closing down every one of these organizations, every women's institute, every tennis club, every Boy Scouts troop, and he did. 2,000 and something organizations done. Of course, people are then left in this horrible, isolated situation. The ultimate paradox of communism, that it isolates everybody, right?
Right. It sells solidarity and it alienates
exactly.
everyone. Yeah.
Has that happened, though, now in the West, not through state action, but just through, young people being online all the time? I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure it has.
I mean, organized religion has been very weak in Western Europe for a long time. Right?
Organized religion has been in decline for a long time, but I still think, there isn't a notable decline in America or in Britain in charitable giving. Mm. There isn't a notable decline in volunteering. People are still prepared. This is the ultimate proof, if you like, of a healthy society, right? That instead of saying, why don't they do something, that you actually do your bit, right? A la Carney. So I'm not sure that can be all of it, but I will say this. I think, going back to the idea of the interglacial, going back to the idea that maybe it was the late 20th century that was unusual. It was unusual for me in two very striking ways. First, there was a clear external enemy throughout that period, right? First, the Nazis and the Japanese, and then the Cold War. And that made people forget their differences, or at least bury their differences. The other thing, and I think this is especially true in this country, there was an unusual degree of homogeneity because the 1920s immigration restrictions had kicked in. So I suspect, I haven't seen the figures, but I suspect that if you look at the 50s and 60s, you will probably find that there is a higher proportion of native-born US citizens than at any other time before or since because of those migration restrictions. People who all watched the same 3 TV networks, all basically went to the same schools, studied the same syllabus. So that may have been the exceptional period. And now that your country and mine and the rest of the world has moved back to an age of mass migration, there is necessarily a lot more cultural heterogeneity, and that brings challenges.
Yeah, and I would add to that, people forget that the World War I generation, with a brief and glorious roaring 20s in between, and then the Great Depression period, the New Deal period, which is a dozen years, segues then into World War II, and then the GI Bill. You had basically a huge generation and a half that had been taught by government that big units were better, that people should fall in line and march in step. And as much as I love to beat the crap out of the damn hippies, I generally hate generational stereotyping to begin with. Listeners of my podcast know that I hate the phrase "greatest generation," in part because if you stormed Normandy, right, and survived, you shouldn't have to pay for a beer for the rest of your life. If you were in a drunk tank in Peoria, why do you get? It's identity. It's the cheapest form of identity politics, to take credit for the bravery of other people, right? But the greatest generation, such as it is, they did more to distort constitutional government in the United States than the hippies did.
Yes.
Because at every stage of their life, the federal government, from the GI Bill through changes to Social Security and whatnot, kept catering to their demands as they went on, building up this entitlement state in their wake.
I think it was especially the war. This is the awful, awful domestic effect of wars. By the way, I love the way you ran Great Depression, New Deal together as though it was the same thing, which of course it was, right? The one having been prolonged for about an extra 7 years artificially by the other, right?
There was a depression, and then the New Deal made it a Great Depression.
Then turned it into the catastrophe that it was, right? I'm glad we agree on that. I think probably still counterintuitive thought for most people. But the UK went in a more statist direction than most of the other Anglosphere democracies because it was in the war for longer and was subjected to the pressures of full mobilization.
And it was also more existential for you guys than it was for Australia or the United States.
Of course, and but really what happened is that it was the change in the mindset that was the worst thing, right? We paid off the debt. I mean, I think we've finally sent our last check to you guys in 2007 or something with a thank you note. Yeah. It wasn't the bombing of infrastructure. It wasn't even the loss of life that was the really permanent change. It was the attitudinal change. In a war, you have to allow a degree of state intervention that in other times would be intolerable. And not only do you have to allow it, but it becomes unpatriotic to complain about it.
Right.
Don't you know there's a war on? That was the phrase. Don't you know there's a war on, right? So that generation were then accustomed to the government running, dragooning people into confiscating things, nationalizing things. And the sort of feeble version of the standard but incorrect version of British history says the country swung left in 1945 with the election of the first Labour majority, and that lasted until Thatcher in 1979. No, if the country swung left, it was in 1940. It was not, 1945, the Labour victory was just putting the belated official stamp on the change that had actually been caused by the necessity of full mobilization. And that was, that I think was the real price that we paid for the war. It wasn't finishing with, the debt that we did and all the rest of it. It was the way in which socialized identity cards, state-run hospitals, state-run schools, everything came
all
from that
the closed-circuit television. It's amazing. Americans would not tolerate some of that Big Brother stuff you've got. No, but it's funny. I just have a piece coming out in the next issue of National Review about how modern progressivism is always, ever since William James coined the phrase moral equivalent of war, has basically been a play on this idea that war is great for mobilizing people to get them loyal to the state. We just don't like the bloody bits, right? And so it's Randolph Bourne, who was this largely forgotten progressive intellectual who coined the famous phrase, war is the health of the state. And part of what he meant by that was he distinguishes three entities, the nation or the country, the government, and the state. And in times of peace, at least in America, you're not supposed to be loyal to the government. The government is a thing where you adjudicate differences, right? It's only when you go to war that all of a sudden the government is magically transformed into the state and you dare not question it. And the aim of progressives in America for a very long time has been to trying to take that attitude and make it a permanent feature of peacetime life. And they've had remarkable success.
And I mean, for me, the greatest works of fiction about the Second World War are the three books that make up Evelyn Waugh's Sword of Honor trilogy. I just think that is, especially from a conservative point of view, I mean, it is the most brilliant conservative critique of. But there's a line there where one of the characters says, when the shooting starts, politics and economics ends, and it's only race and nation that count.
Right.
And it is notable that some of the countries with the most troubled and bloody histories are also the ones that assume the most authoritarian government.
Right.
And I don't think that's a coincidence.
All right, so I have to put on my journalist hat back on for a second, because I would much rather geek out with you as a roundhead.
There'll only be like about 5 people watching, dressed in great collars.
No, I'll tell you this. One of the things about the stupidity of these times, and this is not an ideological point, the reason why podcasts are hugely popular now, and there remains to be seen whether it's the golden age or whether it's the dawn of a new age of podcast, is that cable television news, and I say this as someone who makes part of my living being on cable television and talk radio and all these things, they are so dumbed down to the broadest denominator of a certain group that whether you're on the left or the right or someplace in the middle, people are flocking to these things where they can actually have conversations where people don't scream at each other.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the more popular
conversations.
And
I was saying to you earlier, Americans are primer, more polite, and more civilized than Brits, and will always refuse to believe that, and unless they've lived in Britain for a long time. But I would say the same thing about TV. American TV is now plainly the most intelligent and best made on the planet.
The good stuff.
Right, but again, there is this absolute cultural reluctance to, oh no, but the BBC are so clever, they've all got these funny posh accents, right? The truth is, and it's an odd thing that it took me a while to spot this, there is still a lingering snobbery about TV in the UK, right? If you are a well-educated, upper-middle-class person, you have a TV in the house, but it should never occupy a prominent position. Ideally, it should be you should be able to sort of put it behind doors, and you know. And it is certainly not something you certainly wouldn't spend a lot of money on a great flat screen thing. Whereas, of course, here you're a Harvard professor, no problem at all having a great, you know. And the result is that some TV programs get made for that Harvard professor, whereas almost none get made for his British equivalent.
That's interesting. It goes a long way to explaining Benny Hill.
Yeah.
Which I loved, you know, back in the day. So, all right, I was going to come back to Brexit, but before that, when you say that Americans are more prim and proper and formal than Brits, do you ever see the movie Metropolitan?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, not Metropolitan, Barcelona. Same guy.
As well, yes.
So,
although Metropolitan demonstrates the point rather well, I thought.
It does, and I was a Freudian slip, I shouldn't have mentioned it. When me and my friends saw that, when it came out in the theaters, we were like, oh my gosh, this is what the WASPs were doing while we were going to bars. Because like it was a completely different world in Metropolitan, but I love that movie. But in Barcelona, there's this great little bit about how the Spanish think Americans are rubes because Americans only eat hamburgers. And the problem is that the Spanish don't know how to make hamburgers. So these hamburguesas that they serve them really are garbage. And then they think, well, Americans, of course, are rubes because they eat this garbage, right? Is it that Americans don't think Brits are, is the reason why Americans think Brits are much more prim and proper because there's a selection bias about the Brits we're actually exposed to?
Maybe. Listen, I'll take it, right? I mean, it's terribly flattering. But what every Brit will notice when he comes here for any length of time are some of the following things that within a few days. One, people don't really swear. We swear, as you will have noticed, all the time in conversation. Is quite.
The thing is, we don't recognize that some of the things like bloody and bugger, we don't actually recognize those are swears.
But we do. But we swear more conventionally as well, a lot more. You know, I mean, look at a newspaper, right? Look at what we will print in our papers and what your papers will not print. They will just be too prim to do it. You know, generally people are a bit more correct actually about how they dress. They're certainly much more correct about calling each other sir and ma'am and so on. And there is a great level of civility and courtesy here, which, by the way, I think is fantastic, right? I mean, despite everything, you as an American often complain about the things that are going wrong and the decline and the taking off of guardrails and all that. Right, totally with you on all that, comrade, completely. But, you know, my goodness, you're starting from a good place, right? And that degree of unspoken civility and just it's taken for granted that people are considerate is great. Now we are relatively a quite earthy Hogarthian people who drink a great deal and behave badly in public and get into fights all the time. And yet you guys are so wonderful. You come to Britain and you just avert your gaze from all this. And you somehow go back and say, oh, everyone's terribly polite there. You know? It's fantastic and it's terribly nice of you to say so. But I just think it's very, very difficult to sustain the I mean, by the way, I mean, there's nothing, you know, all these systems can work, right? You can live like an Italian and just sort of shout at people all the time, and it reaches a stable medium, and everyone gets on fine. It's just very amusing to me when you're translated to somewhere else and you don't see what's different.
Well, that's one of the funny things about Americans generally is that, not counting the South really, is we tend not to think we have a culture. And every time any immigrant comes here, they're like, what are you talking about? This place is, you know, as much of a culture as any place else. But we tend to, our cultural understandings tend to be much more invisible to us than I think they are to Europeans who, like the French have a pretty highly developed understanding of what it means to be French.
Yeah.
Americans, you know, it's in the back of our heads.
I would say there's a weird kind of projection going on where the criticisms of the US made by continental Europeans are not just untrue, but are very often more true of Europe than of the US. When people say there's a racial problem, when people say the TV is garbage. I mean, watch an hour of Italian TV and then come back and tell me that American TV is garbage. Come on, you know. When people say, oh, you know, they all live in all these suburbs, and very nice places they are, unlike the suburbs of most French or Dutch or Danish cities which have become no-go areas, right? And the culture thing is the strangest thing. When people say, you know, where's their Shakespeare? Well, given that he was writing, you know, 100 years before the Mayflower set out, the American Shakespeare is Shakespeare, for goodness sake. Every city here has a Shakespeare festival now. Right? You won't find anywhere on the planet where it's more valued. I mean, it's just, people are just extraordinarily reluctant to see what's in front of them.
Yeah, so I guess this also gets to the filtration part. One of the things that a lot of the cultural products we export are things that work in a lot of different languages, right? So they're violent, and there's a lot of nudity, right? So Baywatch was a huge American global export. In America, look, I was the right age group. I'm the right orientation. I've watched my share of Baywatch, but it was always considered sort of campy and dumb, right?
Like Benny Hill, it's only for export. It's only for export.
And, or watching on mute, right? I mean, like watching beautiful women in bathing suits run on the beach has a certain appeal. And but no one mistook it as high culture in America, but that was what gets sent off. It's the hamburguesas that go abroad. We only get your really good TV shows, and so we get, you know, Downton Abbey, which is an adventure in nostalgia as much as anything else, but it's great soap opera, and we get Luther, but we don't get lowbrow stuff from you guys, and you get, and don't you guys? I don't know how much, at least in France, they get of our highbrow stuff, but who knows?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's now much easier because everyone's getting their box sets on, you know, Netflix and so on. But it is striking that almost all the good stuff is still made here. Yeah. And that's partly a function of having a bigger market. It's partly, as I said earlier, it's a function of having a more highbrow market. There is no residual kind of snobbery about it. A certain kind of Brit makes a point of watching foreign language dramas, just, you know, but usually if you put them head to head, they're not really better. It's just the sheer pretentiousness of being able to say, oh, well, you know, I watched this Swedish series.
If you haven't seen it in the original Finnish, don't talk to me. All right, so just to wrap up very quickly on the back to the rank punditry about all this. What do you think is the most likely scenario to happen with Brexit? When do you think it will happen? And what will the reaction among the various parties in England or in the UK look like?
I think Brexit is likely to go ahead this year. There may be a delay of a few weeks, but I don't think it'll be...
The official date is what?
The currently scheduled date is the 29th of March. If a deal is struck, it may require until the end of June to implement it. I don't think anyone would protest about a few extra weeks after 45 years, right? So those I think are probably overwhelmingly the two options, end of March or end of June. Which one it is determined by whether we leave with a deal, in which case it'll probably be June, or whether we leave without a deal, in which case it'll be March, and that would happen only by accident. But we've somehow convinced ourselves that we can't leave without permission, you know, which is basically what securing a deal means, right? And that is extraordinary. Don't get me wrong, I'm utterly in favour of getting a deal with the EU. I shouldn't need saying that it is better to have an amicable, ongoing relationship than not to have. And apart from anything else, we don't want to leave in a way that causes them any problems, right? Because these are our friends, these are our allies, these are our neighbours. And you know what? Even if they weren't, we would still want to have rich neighbours because they make better customers, right? So we have an enduring interest in the stability and prosperity of the EU. But it is an extraordinary leap to go from there to saying we cannot leave unless we've satisfied the EU on all of the following issues. I mean, imagine if you know, in the 1770s, if Franklin and your hero Jefferson and Washington and so on had all said, well, you know, we can't leave unless we have a continuing customs union with Great Britain, and we can't leave unless we continue to accept the supremacy of their law in certain areas, and so. I mean, extraordinary thing. No country ever gets poorer over time as a result of becoming more self-governing, right? You know, you guys voted leave, and it worked out okay, right, from where I'm sitting with all the problems, and the same will be true for us with or without a deal.
Daniel, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonah. Always a pleasure. And I'm so looking forward to reading your book now.
Hey, everyone. That's the end of our discussion with Daniel Hannan. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint. And to learn more about my podcast, The Remnant, check the links in the description below.